Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Vlad Frederick, working with the Montana Book Festival. Happy to present our event, Does Science Plus Fiction equal science fiction? Do you know? Let's find out. First I have, no particular order. Lena Crow is the author of the short story collection, I'm Fine, But You Appear to Be Sinking, Featherproof Books, 2017. Her fiction has appeared in Hayden's Ferry Review, Ninth Letter, Prairie Schooner, and other publications. She lives in Spokane, Washington with her husband and daughter. And then we have Eric Scott Fischel. Eric Scott writes novels of speculative historical fiction and the supernatural, including Dr. Potter's Medicine Show and the upcoming Trials of Solomon Parker. He lives in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains. And last but not least, Joni Wallace earned her MFA at the University of Montana and is the author of 2 books of poetry and a chapbook, Kingdom Come Radio Show, from Barrow Street Press, 2016. Finalist for the Colorado Prize, the Besmore, how would you say that?
Besmore Brigham?
The Besmore Brigham Award, yeah, we'll go with that. WordWorks Washington Prize, and Arojos to the Lighthouse Award. Blinking Ephemeral Valentine, 4-Way Books 2011, winner of the Levis Prize selected by Mary Jo Bang, and Redshift, Core Press 2001, which garnered a fellowship from the Arizona Commission on the Arts. She lives in Tucson, Arizona, where she teaches at the University of Arizona Poetry Center, and has also taught extensively in the Arizona State Prison and Arizona's Pima County Detention Centers. All right, let's give a hand to our wonderful... So, do we want to have me jump into some questions right away for you, or do we want to just talk a little bit first about what's happening?
Should we talk about how we've used science in our recent work?
Yeah, that sounds like a good...
Would you like to?
We're
Okay.
entirely prepared for this panel. Don't dissuade you.
No, I can start. So my most recent book is Kingdom Come Radio Show, and that's a picture of Robert Oppenheimer on the cover, Philippe Hausman's jump photo of him. I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and my father was a scientist at LANL. That's where the Manhattan Project unfolded in the 40s, long before his time there, but that's the place where it happened, where they built the first atomic bomb. So in this particular book, I wanted to write about that history. I think growing up there, both the science and the history and the landscape are incredibly intertwined. And I was always kind of haunted by that human story of this time in our country when we built the thing that can kill all of us or destroy all of human civilization. And in fact, there was a time before they tested the first bomb in White Sands, and I have the documents, and there are little snippets of them in the book, where the scientists thought that the test was going to ignite the atmosphere of the Earth, and we would all perish. They later, quickly, actually within a couple of weeks, were able to theorize that that was not going to happen, but they didn't really know, right? So, so this is a book of lyric poetry, documentary poetry, but it contains science throughout. And one of the things I did when writing it is I consulted with a physicist who was my friend's father. She was one of my best friends growing up, and he was also the son of the physicist who took over leading Los Alamos National Laboratories after Robert Oppenheimer left. That was Norris Bradbury. And so I could call him and ask him questions and email with him, like, how do electrons work, or how did you split the atom? And those things ultimately ended up in these poems to some extent. And what I would say is, I think that both scientists and poets are about observing existence, right? That's really the ultimate question for us, the mystery of existence, both scientists and poets. Scientists are using measurements, hypotheses, other tools to get those answers. Poets are using intuition, but I think we're after the same thing, and that science has a place in poetry and poetry in science. And I would also say that Robert Oppenheimer, would have, however we view him or however history tells us to view him, he was both bad and good, I suppose, but he was brilliant and a physicist, and he would say the best physicist is the child in their backyard playing. They can solve the physics problems that the physicists cannot solve because they use all of their senses and their intuition to solve problems. So that's my story.
So my book is it's a collection of 9 stories that all in some way deal with the natural world or animals or biology. Changes to the environment in which the characters live is a pretty prominent theme throughout. But the details within the book are entirely fictional. I mean, they're fictional stories, right? But also the science within them is fictional. And a friend of mine, the author Sharma Shields, has given me this term for this style of writing. She calls it fiction science, as opposed to science fiction, which is oftentimes speculative and futuristic and sort of looking at, I guess, otherworldly possibilities for science. Much of what I've written here is like the science of the world in which we live, but totally fabricated. And so I guess the big question there is, well, like, the natural world is so interesting and weird in reality, why not, do actual research and include real science in your book rather than making stuff up? And the answer is because I thought it was more fun this way. I feel like I really wrote most of these stories to entertain myself first and foremost, but also because the fictionalizing of science gives me a certain amount of control over the story, and there's this sort of fun experiment in fiction. Any fiction is a plea to, it's made up, but come along with me. Come on, let's see how far we'll go here. And I think that the part of the appeal of fictionalizing science, and in some cases trying to make things sound very, very real, part of that appeal is how far will you come with me on this? And my feeling is always, if the narrative is strong, if the characters are strong, people get behind almost anything in fiction. And that's, I think just part of the fun of it for me is taking what are very serious concerns. I do think a lot about the impact of people living in a changing environment in this book, but tweaking it and morphing it in a way that's man, climate change is kind of a bummer, but it's I don't want to say more. It's the fun of climate change. It's the fun of climate change if I get to rewrite it in my own way. But there's also something really appealing to me of I'm very interested in science writing. I'm very interested in the research people do in the scientific world and then how they convey that to others. And so there's a lot of that language in this book. There's people speaking in a very factually oriented scientific way. But again, it's totally I did no research. This is all fabricated. And so there's a little bit of just playfulness to that, of taking a genre that interests me, but spinning it through the lens of fiction and what fiction can do.
I'm not going to be anywhere near as eloquent as you two. So the stuff that I write is primarily historical speculative fiction. So I write history, but there's a tweak to it. I really like having the framework of, all right, these are the parameters in which you have to work, figure something out. My first book, Dr. Potter's Medicine Show, is about as sciencey as I've gotten so far, for purposes of this panel anyway. It has an alchemy component to it. So what I like about reading history for pleasure and for research for writing it is just being able to kind of dive in and rabbit hole through a lot of these things. And I had a fairly layman's knowledge of what alchemy was, and it's a lot of mysticism and all this kind of thing. But when you kind of start drilling down into it, what alchemy really was like proto-chemistry, and a lot of the what we know as chemistry, those guys immediately built on this alchemical framework. So you got guys like Boyle and Lavoisier and Hooke taking these very secretive, deliberately obfuscated types of experiments and realizing, okay, no, it's not because of the alignment of the planets, it's because of oxygen molecules or this and this and that. So I find science very fascinating, particularly as a way of, when you're writing historical stuff, how a character thinks about science, how any of us think about science is kind of it's a part of the framework of your world at the time. So if someone in the 17th century in England, the way they're viewing the natural world and the world around them is through the lens of what they know about it. In this day and age, it's completely different. So full confession that my day job is in technology, which is possibly why I don't write any kind of tech stuff, because I want to get away from it. Again, I think that. Yeah, sorry, I want to take a step back in. So the publisher that I'm with does a lot of science fiction and fantasy stuff, and there can be this kind of implied ghettoization of the genre fiction that happens that always makes me a little crabby, because honestly any one genre is no better or worse or more or less valid than any other genre. And so when I first saw the title of this panel, I'm like, oh man, is it going to be one of these like why is literary fiction better than science fiction? Why is anything better than science fiction? And I mean, I could go on a rant, which I will spare you. But it's, again, everything is a genre. Just because something has science in it doesn't necessarily make it science fiction. And I was kind of thinking about like, okay, so what, it's like the argument about pornography. You know it when you see it. Like, how do you know science fiction when you see it, as opposed to fiction that's engineered by science or influenced by science? And I remember reading an example that was talking about magical realism versus fantasy. Mm-hmm. And it's not apples to apples, because magical realism has a whole cultural context around it. But the example that was given that I thought was really good was, so you have a story, a guy walks into town and he has angel wings on. So in the fantasy world, the story would be about how did he get these wings and what is he going to do with them, right? Mm-hmm. In the more literary side of it, or magical realism side, if you want to use that term, the story is, how is the rest of the town reacting to him? How is his grandmother thinking about him? I mean, like, how is this character changed, and how are the people around him changed because of this semi-arbitrary component? And I think with fiction that has a science element, it's kind of a similar type of idea. And I think that's all I got.
Seems like a good introduction. Would each of you like to read a short excerpt of a piece and then hop into some more full-on questioning?
Sure. Yeah.
You want to start?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to read a couple sections from the first part of the book. And the name of this, it's a long poem. Everyone's like, oh my God. I promise I'm not going to read that much. It's called Oppenheimer Drive, which is the name of a street, where Oppenheimer's house is, but it's the name of a street in Los Alamos where his house was. The streets in that town are named for bombs and bomb tests, interestingly enough. And, growing up there, I didn't know that. I mean, it was so weird later to think, Trinity Drive, where we would, sneak to smoke cigarettes in high school, whatever, was named for the test of the atomic bomb. The town is full of those references. So this is a poem where I am, in my imagination, walking through that town and thinking about the history and the science, what happened there, and my own life there. And I think you'll hear some of the references to the science. Oppenheimer Drive. Here in the atomic city, shape of a petal bone on the Jemez Mountains. Here my house, my mother's, my father's, beside the canyon, a stable, an Appaloosa on which to ride. One history as cacophony, hoofbeats across a mesa. one's own history as illusory, a street or field, scatter of mule deer glimpsed at dusk. See how twilight makes its game, hat, rabbit, chattering off. Swag of deer in head-to-tail formation. If I open the curtain, cutting room where one sits and sits some more. If I am metro and send fly sheet on the table, invisible ink pen to ink in the ghost particles, sinkers on the trinket tray, all the way to China. If I am cinematographer, stand still these skies, a silver screen uranium drive-in. If I am audiographer, boom, boom, says the boom carpet. If I am oneographer, that's the dream grapher. Beginning, middle, end deer, a threnody. Enter deer tagged U235, a smasher, rye whiskey, a cry. Inner deer made of light, star of light emitted just here. Enter deer with a window for a side, lilies, a bone-white plexus. And enters Oppenheimer. He sees his decent suit. Within the image library, oh, of surprise and a sound like no legs, no tail, a hush across and never touching a dance floor. Hello, you, and you, and you, and you in your flammable coats, says he. And I'll just read one more section. This references Gerard Tahouf, who was a physicist who charted electron interactions. In Tahouf's rendition of the unseeable, one can walk right through a flickering herd of deer. It's a kind of reversible spell. Any number of constellated points tinseled or haloed, attuning along a vapor of deer, and opens into a theater, hum or hymn. Forest, sky, melody, harmony. These songs I sang as a child. If I reverse the spell, woods a thicket reassembles into a room so bright. The forest presentation of come in, little match. If I put my hand through, 27 bones. If I put a foot through, 26. Bone testament. So when I sing, follow the string.
So I'm going to read to you just a page from a story called End Times. This page comes sort of in the middle. All you really need to know is that the apocalypse is happening, and there's two humans who I think are mentioned in this section. Aaron is the protagonist's husband, and Cole is their 15-year-old son. The second symptom of an impending end of the world is that the moon speeds up. Instead of completing a circuit around our planet once every 27.2 days, it gradually moves faster and faster until people see a full moon on an almost weekly basis. The most concerning side effect from the moon's acceleration is a corresponding acceleration of the Earth's tides. Where the tide normally comes in and goes out twice a day, once the apocalypse nears, it instead comes in and goes out upwards of 7 times in a 24-hour period. This is extremely disruptive to the planet's ocean life, and many of the creatures that dwell close to the shore beach themselves out of confusion. To unsuspecting observers, it may appear as if the sea is literally belching up its inhabitants, forcibly expelling them from their watery homes. The morning, fish, mollusks, and several small sharks begin to wash up along Alki Beach. Cole will be getting ready for school, drinking instant coffee with the TV turned to the morning news. When he sees the news report, he'll take Aaron's car, though he'll only have his learner's permit and not a real driver's license, and drive to the shore. He will stand beside the newsmen, the baffled lifeguards, and the team of marine biologists from the University of Washington and survey the scene. Then he will return home to gather up all the plastic tubs and buckets he can find. He will change into his Boy Scout uniform because he will feel the outfit lends him some air of authority. He will drive back to the beach and begin collecting sea creatures from the sand, one per tub or bucket, which he will fill first with seawater. No one will interfere with his activities. Back at the house, Cole will transfer the larger creatures to sinks and bathtubs, each with a rubber stopper jammed tight over the drain. The smaller fish will stay in their buckets for the time being, placed in a neat row below the living room window so they can enjoy some natural light. Despite his often cold approach to other people, my son will always have a soft spot for animals. He'll always make it his mission to rescue any pets lost in our neighborhood, and he'll insist each year that one of his Hanukkah presents be a donation to the Humane Society. Still, that Cole would skip school and violate traffic laws to resuscitate half-dead sea slugs will come as a surprise to Aaron, and a little bit to Cole himself, though he won't admit it.
So this book comes out on Tuesday, actually, so I've never read from it. This is the big debut.
Yeah.
So,
What is the book?
sorry, I'm a terrible marketer. It's called The Trials of Solomon Parker. It's a loosely related standalone to the first book. You don't have to know one to know the other. It's kind of a careful what you wish for type of story that's set in mostly in Butte during the Copper Wars, so the early 1900s. So the reason I'm going to read this little snippet, one, it's short-ish, a few pages, but I wrote this a couple years ago, and so who all here is local-ish? Everyone? Okay, so we're all sick of fires, right? So I wrote this a couple years ago when we were down Bitterroot around Florence. It was just, not as bad as this year, but a lousy fire year. And there is, completely unrelated to that, there's this theme of smoke and fire that kind of permeates this book. And I've had a couple people ask me, like, oh, is this because of the fire? It's like, well, no, I wrote it 2 years ago. But with that said, so this is, we're starting in Stevensville in 1900. And sorry, I can't remember, there may be some salty language in here, but if that offends you, I apologize in advance. If it does, don't buy the book, because you will not like it. Okay. Flame and smoke. It's all she can think about most days. It's always so hot and the room is so close. A fiery summer, the lights of which she's never felt. Smoke from the wildfires to the west floats lazily in air that feels like treacle in her lungs. She can't breathe. Always the smell of it in her nose. With the back of a sleeve, she rubs the sweat from her forehead, blinking in the dim light that seeps under and between the curtains. He hates that she keeps the room so dark, the drapes shut, but it's just so hot and the light so bright, the air so thick. When he comes home from the tavern, the first thing he'll do is throw the windows open, pull the curtains aside, yell about fresh air. He'll push past her, reach down into the crib, pick the baby up, swinging it around and making sounds like everything is normal. Nibble a belly, tickle toes, like everything is fine. She feels hollow, wrung out, filling up with smoke, burning up from the inside out. So hot all the time, so tired. This isn't right. She isn't the way she should be, but some days she just can't stop crying. It's hard to think. Sometimes, some days, she just doesn't think she can do this, can't continue. She stands over the baby, listens to it wail, a sharp keening of need. She breathes in its milky, musty smell. Night after night, she pushes the pillow down over her ears, tries to hide from the baby's constant screaming until her husband forces her to get up, to tend to it. I'll get you some more help soon, he says, but you need to feed him now. He's just hungry. The baby leached to her like a coal at her breast, night after sleepless night. At first, her husband found a woman to help, but she'd chase the old bitch out for the knowing looks, the snide remarks. That woman all sweetness and light when he was here, sure. But as soon as the door closed, the bitch stared dagger eyes at her, sharp and judging. You poor thing, she'd said. You sad, weak fool, what she meant. Crazy girl, crying all the time, curled up in the dark. The woman would hold the baby, coo at it. There, she'd say, there. The two of them looking at her with big blue eyes. Her husband came running when the neighbors found them, pinned her arm, took the knife away from her. The old bitch crying as hysterically as the baby in her arms. Sad, weak fool, is that right? She rubs her wrists, feeling where the old hurt was, long gone now. The tears are wet on her face as she looks down in the crib where her son sleeps, the child that she and her husband made. The red, squalling thing, whimpering, feverish. It wasn't supposed to be like this. They tried so long, she and her husband. Years and years it started sweet and then soured like bad water. She learned that whatever was inside her wasn't right, and each new child would dissolve and fall out of her in a hot rush of blood. Her body was poison, toxic ground in which nothing wholesome could grow. But they tried and tried and tried. They both wanted a child so badly, and now they had it. The woman at the birth, pushing the baby out towards her, pressing it hot and slick against her, insistent. "Take your son," they said. She barely felt the doctor's fingers between her legs, checking her for damage. "Take your son." Her husband, half drunk, holding to the child, refusing to believe. Even now he refuses to stop pretending. "Take your son." She stares into the crib. In one hand she holds the unlit lantern, feels its weight, the sloshing of the fuel inside. It's so hot in the room and she can barely breathe, and it's hard to see through her tears. You won't be home for hours yet. A clatter at the window, scratching. That raven is outside on the ledge again. A big, ratty black thing with flat, shiny eyes. It's been coming around for days. Gone crazy from the fires, blown in from the smoke maybe. Trying to get inside, cawing, a rough, almost human sound. No, no, no. But it's just a bird, that's all. Its noise quieter now. So quiet she can barely even hear it over the pounding of blood in her ears. The baby squirms, red-faced, looks up at her with wide eyes. As she swings it by the wire handle, the lantern's weight stretches at the end of her fingers as if seeking release, so she lets it go. There's the crack of glass, the bite of kerosene. A thin puddle slops across the dry wooden floor towards her feet, pooling around the leg of the crib. Hazy waves shimmer in the air, climb up her legs, or maybe she just imagines it. Watching the child, she pulls the matches from her pocket of her apron. Flame and smoke, she thinks. The matches scratch against the wood of the crib, and there's another sound, the bird again, something else. She ignores it, one last thought blistering through her brain. Burning.
Oh, a spoiler. Did she kill the baby?
That's what I want to know.
So this book has a very circular type of a plot. So possibly yes and possibly no, possibly both things. Here, a little science, right? So it's the baby is Schrodinger's baby. It's not nearly all this dark. So
I think I've been worrying at a question throughout this. I don't know if it's going to actualize in a sensible way, but I guess let's give it a shot. So we've kind of talked about how fabricated science, Lena, you mentioned, like there's kind of this idea of invitation, like how far are you going to go on this with me? And in that, it seems to me maybe there's an implied attempt to fascinate, an attempt to catch, not just invite. And so I guess this is making me think about the definition of science. If science comes from a desire to understand, do you think that same desire is being capitalized upon in fabricated science?
That's a good question.
And I pose that to each of you. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that same impulse exists, right? Like, I feel like in my stories where the fictionalized science comes out is by way of exposition, like to explain something that's going on in the world. So it's that impulse to make sense, to have the answers, but also I think that I employ it in my writing in other ways to do the opposite, to confuse a little bit, like to recreate a world that is both believable because it sounds like science, but is so bizarre as to be unbelievable. And so there's this conflict of like, this looks like something that I want to believe, but I don't want to believe it. And I think that is maybe for me one of the appeals of fictionalized science.
Yeah.
A long time ago, back in the 70s, a science fiction writer and editor named Damon Knight, who had a long series of original anthologies of short stories, told me, quite directly, don't explain too much. And another writer I know, Jim Glass, who comes usually once a year for MuseCon, said, explain, he didn't say exactly, explain only as much as you need for the plot and go no further. How did that strike you?
I feel like that's true for like all of fiction, right? Like that applies for not just science fiction or science writing, but basically like any exposition.
So it would be true for history too.
Yeah, well, and a lot of fiction is, it's you're coming up with shortcuts or not shortcuts per se, but you're packing a lot of meaning into the smallest amount of stuff. Whether that's a hint of some internally consistent but made up scientific framework, whether it's packing language into words like in a poem. One of these days I'm going to sit on a panel and not bring what I'm going to bring up now, but I just found it so fascinating that you guys get to hear it. So Robert Caro is a historian. He's written all these very dense, thick, long books that are kind of history done with a very literary style of writing. And so he's 4 volumes into a big history of LBJ. And so I read an interview with him a couple years ago now, and obviously it stuck with me quite a bit. And he's talking about his research process and talking to all these people who were around LBJ. And so one of the things he ferrets out is in the White House, in LBJ's White House, they had a low, squishy couch. And LBJ, who was a big guy, who was 6'3", 6'4", something like that, he had a tall, hard wooden chair. And so a lot of the way he got things done was by being a bully, right? And so just like the fact of knowing that little thing, you could say that in a sentence, the difference between these 2 chairs, it unpacks so much about who LBJ was. Like, he is the kind of bastard who would do that, that he would set all this up. And so it's like one sentence hint at what I just sat here and blabbered on for 2 minutes about, right? And so I think that's, absolutely correct, that just give the reader what they need to know without confusing them, and, the natural progression of thought will kind of continue a lot of things on if you do it right.
And I would say a parallel in poetry is don't simplify complexity. Like the goal of the poem is not to say, here's this wonder or this whatever idea we're talking about, and then some little ending that pulls it all together to you. That's not what the poet's job is, and it's not truthful to do that, because the world is complex, our lives are complex, our interiorities are complex. So that seems parallel to me in poets' land.
But like with poetry, you do have to condense complexity.
Distill.
Yeah. How do you? How? Question mark.
Well, I think in poetry it's about language, right? Poetry is about sound and language and rhythm and all these different things that you do with poetry. It's almost we use language as our medium, right? In a way that fiction writers don't think about it that way. Maybe, I don't know, but I'd love to hear how you feel about that. So why is the question? Distill, because I believe that words are like atoms in a way, they really have an atomic structure, and as you move them and place them next to each other, they make different meanings. So it's meaning making with words as little structures.
Right on.
Don't ask me any more about that.
I think I might have fermented on another question while we were sitting here. At some point earlier on, I heard the word apocalypse, and that kind of struck a note with me with the idea of fabricated science and science fiction, because I feel like these large cataclysmic events are very often rife in that literature, and of course it's also like kind of rife in a lot of just original spiritual systems around the world, like Norse mythology. There's Ragnarok, there's there's the Rapture, there's all kinds of these large cataclysmic events coming from a spiritual concern. How does that play out in fabricated science? What's the corollary here? This isn't as lucid of a question, sorry.
No, I think that's like, like that definitely touches on something that there's a lot of apocalypse fiction out there. It's almost a whole genre unto itself. And I've got my apocalypse story, and if you are into both fiction science and science fiction, there's a big appeal there, because in literature the luxury of creating the world however you want it, right? You can create a world that's small, you can create a world that's large. If you get to write an apocalypse story or novel, you get to uncreate the world. And that's almost, just as much of an appeal. So yeah, to like geek out on the science of like, how am I gonna destroy the world? Like, that's great. And you got the zombie apocalypses are very popular, obviously. Like some sort of plague is great. My apocalypse story is basically the sort of universe itself is becoming unhinged, and that's destroying the world. And there's a circular component to it. It's happening over and over and over, but in slightly different ways. So yeah, like that's just, again, it's just good fun science. And because it's something that has no real, like, you can't be like, well, let's look at previous apocalypses for basis. Like, there's no pressure to be accurate. You get the luxury of completely making up something that we're like, yeah, the world probably will end at some point, but, it could be anything.
Well, there's that talk of like unmaking the world. There's so many ways you can unmake it. You can unmake the world as a whole. You can unmake, and I think that's why there are so many different kinds of apocalypse stories out there, because there's so many facets of the apocalypse. There's the forest burning down, and I'm still talking about fires. The forest burning down. There's the atmosphere catching fire. There's the economy collapsing. So I was thinking about this earlier, that you talk about science and fiction. I think most of us, myself included, think about physics and biology in some kind of a modern framework, but economics is a science, sociology is a science, and so I like a lot of those ideas where the apocalypse has come upon us in some small sort of way. Currency has collapsed, and now we're all, hiding from the cannibal gangs that are going to steal our precious blood, or whatever your shtick is. But as writers, you put a bunch of characters in the ant farm and then shake it. You don't get a bigger shake than your apocalypse stories.
I think poets are always writing about the personal apocalypse, right? Keats, everyone are always writing about death, right? That's the favorite poet topic, love and death. So you make and unmake things in poetry all the time in a different but similar impulse.
Go ahead, Drew.
Ms. Carl, your fiction science about animals, are you, is the fiction about what the DNA does or what the animals become, or is it, I don't understand.
Yeah.
Give me an idea of.
Sure, for sure. It's sort of a few different things, mostly just because I like animals and so I write about them in different contexts. But I do have one story where the protagonist finds an animal and it's unclear what it is, and nobody can tell what it is. It's sort of a hybrid creature that she befriends, but it's clearly a wild animal, but it's an unknowable creature. And then in another story, there's this sort of phenomenon that used to happen in a city involving a lot of squid. Like squid, like just a massive population of squid existing in Monterey Bay, and the protagonist is remembering this from her childhood and trying to find out what caused that, because it's no longer the case. And there's also some issues with like memory and cognition in that story. In another story, an invasive species of snake has taken over the wheat fields of the Palouse. I like animals in large groups, apparently, like anything that's like a swarm.
What is
that's
the
coming
collective
for
for
us.
snakes?
Oh, you know what? When they hatch, it's a clutch. Yeah, but I don't know what like unrelated snakes are. That's a good question. Yeah.
Well, the birds would be fiction science.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and another good example of things in a swarm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the birds a lot.
I'm with you now, thank you.
Is there another hand at the same time this direction?
Well, this is fairly specific. You grew up in Los Alamos.
Yes.
I wonder if you have come across books about, a year old, a novel by Gregory Benford called The Berlin Project.
I don't know of it, but I'll look it up.
There, little or none of it is actually set in Los Alamos, but the entire background is the Manhattan Project.
Okay.
And Oppenheimer has a kind of walk-on part. Every character but two in that novel is a real person. Fermi,
Right.
Leslie Groves, the whole
All the
shebang.
guys, right?
And just because of your connection, you may find it interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's a superb
That's
novel.
maybe the only one I haven't read. I read many of them this past couple of years, but that one I didn't find.
My
Yeah.
recommendation.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll read it. I want to ask you, have you seen or read about all the moon jellies that are filling up the Sea of Japan? It makes me think of your squid story probably because of global warming. I think they have these massive blooms of these glowing jellyfish. And
Yeah, I've heard
I have
of
a
that.
poem about
yeah.
that.
Oh, really? Awesome.
Imagine walking that beach with all those jellies.
Yeah.
everywhere.
And that's like part of the thing about like fiction science that I do sometimes feel guilty about is that the real world is in fact weirder than anything that I come up with.
I don't know
like
if it's
I've heard-
weirder.
Man, it's
You're pretty weird.
Thank you. That's kind of you to say. I just read The Soul of an Octopus by Sly Montgomery.
Yeah,
Have you
I
read
read
that? Like
Amazing.
and- right? But so weird. Like that is. While you guys are in a bookstore, before you leave, you should buy The Soul of an Octopus
Yeah,
by
it's
Sly
amazing.
by Sly Montgomery. And like I learned some stuff about octopuses that I didn't know, even as somebody who I write about cephalopods and quite a bit. There's even a sort of octopus-like creature on the front of the book. And yeah, I read that book and I was like, that's so much weirder than anything I could have. Did you know that male octopuses, one of their tentacles is their penis? Actually, a lot of people are nodding. They're like, yeah, we knew
Yeah,
about
we know.
that.
Does it matter which one?
It does. Yeah, it's always it's the same one.
Oh, okay, it's always the same.
Yeah, like like
Would you
nature's
eat one?
really weird. I'm not the
Are you
penis
vegetarian?
specifically.
No,
or-
the octopus.
I'm not an octopus eater. No, I do feel kind of an affinity for them,
Yeah.
and so I.
I wonder how many
Yeah.
octopus penises we've consumed. I eat
Yeah.
octopus. I wonder
I
chowing
think
down
they
on
just
octopus. dog.
fry those
No.
up.
They don't denote it especially when it's sushi.
I feel like you should have to pay extra. 'Cause that's like a special
Right. It's like
tentacle.
the Otoro, the fine fatty belly. That costs more. I have a question that I don't know if it really falls within the realm of science, more in the realm of maybe poetry, prose kind of thing. There was a thing you said earlier, Joni, about a poet, and I kind of paraphrase it as poet isn't tying it up in a neat bow. The idea that you can't just like have something cohesive that you just slap one little finalizing sentence on, and that's like what poetry is. And I guess my question would be, having also read short fiction and often finding that I'm okay with an uncertain ending in short fiction too, does that mean then that the length of a piece means that you need, if a piece is longer, does that necessitate more wrap up? Can you get away with less wrap up when the piece is shorter? Does a long
Good
piece, a
question.
full novel, require wrap up? Is that coming out? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I feel like we should let the novelists speak
Yeah,
on
let
that.
the novel.
Yeah, you know that's a really good question, and I think the short answer is maybe. No, I'm a big fan of uncertainty, and I think I'm perhaps a little hypersensitive because, you know, what you as the writer think is like just a vague suggestion that people are going to be able to at least kind of follow on to. Oftentimes is just completely too vague. I think being vague for the sake of being vague is, I find, kind of off-putting. But I just read a book, and I'm not going to mention. I will mention the title because I liked the book, and there are things about it I didn't like. So, Universal Harvester by John Darnielle, and it's a book that has a very kind of non-linear narration kind of thing going on. It kind of builds towards a big reveal that may or may not happen. So it's a short novel. It's not super long, but it's novel length, and it definitely implies a bunch of stuff without ever wrapping it up in a bow. And in this particular case, I didn't think it worked, but had it been, if they'd done nothing else but change it into a collection of short stories, it would work perfectly. Like, the writing was beautiful, the characters were very sparsely but well drawn, and so like the things, the non-linearity and the kind of disjointed stuff that didn't quite come together in a way, if it was semi-related short stories or even really related short stories, I think it would have implied that, you know, cohesion at the end. It's a good book. I would recommend reading it if you like that kind of thing. I've talked about it with a couple people, and we've all kind of had a similar idea. So anyway, that's.
I think it's for sure true. Like, I don't know, every time I send my mom stories that I've written, she always calls and is like, I really like them except for the end. I think it should keep going. And so if you want to read like a bunch of stories that my mom thinks should keep going, enjoy my collection. But yeah, like there's definitely like, I don't know, I heard this quote like years ago, and I wish I knew who originally said it because I use it all the time, and it's that the difference between a novel and a short story is that novels are redemptive and short stories are punitive. And I think that the endings have to do with that like if you want to go ahead and not like really wrap things up, that's
A short story.
a short story, and it's
No
probably
matter how long
like,
it is.
yeah, like we don't have to have a resolution, and that's usually punitive
Right.
in its nature. I don't know. With poetry, I mean, there is like, do you feel like you kind of, like, you don't want to wrap things up in a neat little bow, but you kind of have to stick the landing? Is that
Yeah,
true
or not, because you know, poets, we move things around, and you're going for the musicality, I think, in the end. But what I'll say to that is, I'm a T.S. Eliot fan, and he said of Keats' famous poem "Ode to a Grecian Urn," you know, it ends, "Beauty is truth, and truth is beauty." And T.S. said, a perfectly horrendous ending to an otherwise good poem. Which was harsh, but in a way, after I read T.S. Eliot, I thought about it a lot more, and he does kind of, that ending feels slapped on. It kind of does. It's like, I wrote about this urn and all these incredible thoughts, and I constructed this beautiful thing, and now I'm going to tell you what I mean, you know.
Of course he was ironic.
Yeah. Was he ironic? I don't know.
I think he was.
You think he was
I
ironic?
think he was.
Well, how come T.S. doesn't think that?
Because Thomas Stearns was a modernist and Keats was a romantic.
And were the
And
romantics?
romantic doesn't torpedo thinking, but it's a different kind of thinking than modern.
Well, interesting.
Now that's
Interesting.
me being a lecturer.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that point. I will be thinking about that.
Thank
I'm interested in the moon jelly conversation we're having. Because
The moon
this is a
jellies.
question about research. So I grew up in a place where jellyfish floated to shore, and little kids would run on the beach in the jellyfish and get stung by the tentacles, even if they were dead for 24 hours or 48 hours. So kids learn very quickly that these beautiful, really interesting looking creatures on the sand are painful. And I think that's the interesting thing in a story. If you know that, and you can put that, if you researched that and knew about it and wrote about it, that would draw you into the reality. I mean, to me, that's the research part of writing. I don't know. What do you think?
It's the research, and it brings me to this great quote that I was telling you earlier that I found, and now I don't know who said it, unfortunately. Science dissolves beauty. Does it? I mean, the beautiful jellyfish, glowing, you want to pick it up, it's a toy, stings you, sends you to the hospital. So if we know the science, does it destroy the beauty of the jellyfish, or does it make it more beautiful? Makes it more complex.
Yeah.
Is complexity
That's what I
beauty?
like about it.
Yeah. Do you want
Yeah.
to speak to that?
Yeah, like, man, I was being like kind of obnoxious and flippant. Like when she said that quote earlier, I was like, poet. Like, what is that even? But that explanation was so good. I get it now. But like, I think, yeah, like to your point, like, that is absolutely, I think, the function of research is that you research until you find the humanity, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, and that's the humanity of the situation is like, you know, the little kids who are like, yeah, so enamored that they get hurt by the jellyfish. And I feel like that is always the appeal for me, for sure. Like, you read until you hit something where you're like, that's the human moment. And that's the only thing that makes, I think, not the only thing, but that's the thing that makes science writing, whether it's real science or fictionalized science, like stick with you anyway, right? Is where you hit the human moment. And so that's what, like, if you're a fiction writer and you're writing science, that's what you're striving for sure, I think.
Well, that's what we're all striving for, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the fictionalized science, the narrative, the storytelling, and the poet, we're all trying to get to deeper truth or meaning,
Yeah.
but we make up stuff to get to it.
So as we're sitting in here in a bookstore, what are some good science inflected or science fiction books that y'all have come across that you like?
Yeah.
I can go so you can mull.
Yeah, you gotta go first.
So being a technology guy and not wanting to bring it home, I don't read a ton of it, but I've read a few recently that I really enjoyed. The Wonders, Meg Howry. The setup is it's a Mars training simulation kind of thing. So they put all these people in, I think it's in Hawaii somewhere, and they're in this simulator for a number of months. And it's very well researched science, from the psychology to all the computery stuff and all that kind of thing. But it's the characters that really kind of draw you in. That was lovely. And
Gary, would you repeat the author on that?
I think her last name is spelled Howrey.
Okay.
Meg Howry. What's the other one?
Nice.
I had another good example. Sorry. Oh, The Sparrow. I don't know if y'all read that. It's a great book. And again, it's like, who cares that they're in space? They could be anywhere. It's just the characters are so great. And I think that's one. So me as a tech nerd, when I read books, the technology part that I know. So I work in computers, which a lot of people do. So you should be able to do that research, authors. And so when it's wrong and it draws you out of the story, it's so frustrating. But both of those books, and I'm not a physicist or a Martian specialist by any means, so there may be things that were wrong, but it felt real and complete. So that's me.
Jeff Vandermeer, I think,
I was
is an
gonna ask if you
author
read
who, Born, which just came out, super interesting, like science fiction, science writing, and his trilogy, the Southern Reach trilogy, which is about basically a section of the United States that has become uninhabitable. Like, nature is sort of taking it back, but in a very like weird otherworldly stuff is happening, and that like trilogy I think is a really interesting example of this type of writing for sure. James Vandermeer, all of his, anything by him, just go to town.
I would say for fictionalized science, I guess a writer I love is I'll just go backwards to Ray Bradbury.
Yeah.
I mean, he writes like a poet. I think there's not. Maybe that's why it appeals to me. His sentences are unbelievably gorgeous, and all the layering that he does, and how he works with language. And a poet I would mention is Lainey Sikelianos. She really works with science. She has a new book out. I think it's called Animal Kingdom. Do you know? You're nodding like you know. I think it's.
I don't have it.
I think it's called Animal Kingdom, and it's about species that have gone extinct, and she's researched them so that she has the sounds that they made and like different things about them. It's very beautifully done. So.
Does anyone have any more questions as of right now, or do you folk up there in the hot spot have more questions that you feel have not been aired?
I have one more question. There's a type of science fiction that is Patrick O'Brian in space. You know the author Patrick O'Brian? who
Called
writes-
space opera.
Space opera?
Well, I'm thinking much smaller than that, where you have a ship with people on it, and you describe the ship and all its details and all of the equipment on board, and it goes somewhere or it fights something. And there may be a lot of description in it about the communication devices or the medical equipment on board, but you're really dealing with 150 people on board and their dynamics. And in some ways, to me, it seems like it's straight science. The author spends a huge amount of time talking about the technology. But what makes it interesting is the people that they throw on it. Yeah,
I'll put rank on this because I know about it.
yeah.
Get a paperback called Aurora, Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah, I know her.
I feel like, yeah, thank you so much. These were
Thank you.